Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Sydney on this beautiful spring evening. Our speaker tonight is Professor Bill Bowtell, AO, one of Australia's foremost health policy strategists. Since early last year, he's written, broadcast, and even tweeted indefatigably on our response and the international response to the coronavirus pandemic. He's been a generous participant in Institute events. Tonight, his focus is on regional aspects of Australia's role with COVID. We'll have 30 minutes for Bill to address us approximately, followed by 30 minutes for your questions and discussion points. Please log in with your question using the Q&A function on Zoom. You can do that at any time during the address or during the discussion. But for now, it's over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Ian, and to all at AAAA in New South Wales for putting this on tonight. And thank you all for joining in what I hope will be an interesting discussion, as COVID matters always are, full of colour and light and movement. It's a very tough topic. I mean, here we are, it's just on 24 months now since in November 2019, the coronavirus emerged, crossed over from animals to humans in or around Wuhan in China, with cataclysmic results for the world. The fact that the virus emerged was nothing special in the way of these things. Viruses have been crossing the species barrier for millions of years between animals and humans. It happens ceaselessly and remorselessly. What exactly happened in Wuhan is still to be determined, but it is a bit beside the point. The fact is that it happened. But it was the response to what happened in Wuhan in November 2019 that has now played out around the world in very many tragic and different ways for the last 24 months. The point about viruses is this, that none of this was unpredictable, unpredicted. It was not, as people might like to sometimes say, a black swan event, but as Adam Tooze, who just wrote this very good book on the economic consequences of COVID, said that it was more like a grey rhino. It was there in the underbrush, always going to happen, and it did happen. Now, in the last 40 years or so, I became involved in viruses, I think, way back when I was advisor to the Australian Health Minister when HIV/AIDS emerged in the world. And it's just worth noting that the HIV virus has killed many more people, regrettably, directly than COVID has, and it is the greatest pandemic of our times. It emerged into a completely unsuspecting world, it has to be said, in the 1980s, and created mayhem and havoc, particularly in the developing world. But since then, in those 40 years, viruses have emerged with metronomic regularity. From HIV, we've had SARS and MERS and Ebola and Zika, Hendra, varying versions of avian flu. And thanks to the lessons we learned the hard way with HIV, those viruses, some which were much more contagious than the original COVID, were contained pretty well. The system worked for 4 decades, remarkably well. So even Ebola, very infectious, was contained locally and stamped out. And I think we can ask now, or begin to ask some serious questions about how did this go so wrong with COVID? Viruses emerge. We should have had the systems in place to detect, to move fast, to contain the problem, but we didn't, with the catastrophic results we've seen in the last 24 months. It goes back, I think, to a lesson that I learned, many of us learned in the HIV times, that nature creates viruses remorselessly and ceaselessly. But really, what creates a pandemic, what compounds the problem, is a political question. What policies are adopted to contain or not contain the emergence of the virus, and how swiftly are they implemented, and to what effect? How much do we base our response on science and evidence, and how much is it on politics? And it won't surprise you to know that, of course, I believe that in the West, particularly, the political response to COVID ensured that what was a serious problem, in fact, became a cataclysmic one. It created, in the West at least, what you might call, Adam Tooze calls a polycrisis. A health problem morphed into an economic one, and a social and now a political one. So after 24 months, I think we're certainly over the end of the beginning, but are we near the beginning of the end of it? And I don't think we really are. We have got to look very deeply at the causes, how we got into this mess. And if we fall for the idea that because of wishing and hoping for it to go away, that it's going to fade away next year, I think that would be a very great error indeed. We can look back in the build up to the COVID problem in Wuhan. There's no doubt if you combine large numbers of people with large numbers of animals in urban settings, and you have poor sanitation, you have the mixing of blood and urine and feces and so on and so forth, and you stir it all around, you're almost guaranteed that a mutation, a virus will emerge from the animal community and will cross over to humans. That's completely well established. And of course, in much of the world, we've spent many decades separating out humans and animals, husbandry, slaughtering, consumption, food, and doing that. But in a place like China, where there's been this enormous shift from agrarian to urban settings, those systems clearly in a place like Wuhan and provincial China were not as strong as they ought to have been. And in the rest of the world, in the developing world, as you've seen, urbanisation and animals and humans mixing, things are still nowhere near where they ought to be. So after 24 months, what do we get? Health, economic, social, political. On the health side, statistics are pretty grim. 254 million cases, 5 million deaths directly caused by COVID, and many multiples of that 5 million have been indirect excess deaths. There have been deaths and illnesses caused because of the collapse or the clogging up of the health system. So people who tried to be treated or assessed for non-COVID related questions haven't been able to access care and treatment and support. And that, of course, has had a knock-on effect. I know I've been associated with the Global Fund over many years, HIV, TB, malaria. The drugs for these diseases, the distribution of these have been greatly disrupted by the COVID pandemic in the poor and developing countries. But of course, in the rich countries as well, people, particularly in Europe, America, have not been able to access care that they need. And there's been a very great indirect effect on health and welfare. And then mental health, despair, disruption, all of the things that go along with that have been really serious effects of the health consequences of COVID. And of those 250 million odd cases of COVID, many have recovered, of course, which is great, with no lasting effects, but a proportion of those have developed what we call long COVID. And it's only 24 months. And what are the effects of people who've had a very serious brush with COVID, maybe being in ICU, which is bad enough in itself, and then the lengthy and long-term recovery from COVID. It's certainly not influenza. one of the great mistakes about dealing with COVID was to slot it in as some sort of influenza, that you got it, you recovered, there wasn't a long effect if you recovered and didn't die. That doesn't seem to be the case with COVID. So on the economic side, there's the health side. As Adam too says in his book, 95% of the world's economies had GDP contraction in 2020. This is unprecedented in modern times. 3 billion adults were furloughed at least, that is, lost their jobs and had to be supported by payments of one sort or another. 1.6 billion at least young people had their education severely disrupted. And I'm sure the interns and everybody in Australia knows how deeply disruptive and unsettling that's been. Whole sectors and industries have been polarised. Tourism, travel, education, many other sectors have suffered grievously from the suddenness of the circumstances, the lockdowns, the stopping of people moving internally within countries and between countries. The World Bank estimates about $10 trillion loss of lifetime earnings in just 24 months. And now as we go into the third year of COVID, we see the pernicious second-term effects coming around, not the immediate consequences of job losses and so on, which are recovering as people can go back to work with vaccinations in the rich countries, but inflation has returned for the first time in 40 years, and serious inflation. We have supply chain disruption, which is not going to be temporary, but is really locking in permanently. We have problems with migration. We certainly have under and unemployment questions. We've had this zero interest rate policy, which of course has been very important as money has had to be spent to support people, but that's playing through into really serious asset price inflation, and nowhere more seriously than in the price of housing in Australia and around the world, thanks to this zero interest rate policy. And wages and profits are all over the place, and there's been massive growth in inequality. Huge profits have accrued to large corporations and to the already very well off. Thank you very much. And that's been done at the expense in Australia and elsewhere of lower and middle income people. And there's been a big shift of assets and money to the rich and the wealthy. When you get to the politics of it, well, here we are. After COVID emerged, we had the whole spectrum of the response, from the neoliberal economies and politics at one end to what I'd call the socialist or collectivist economies at the other. The neoliberals, particularly in the United Kingdom, the United States under the previous administration, Brazil, with a few followers and so on in Sweden, their view is to let it in, let it run, that nothing could be done, borders couldn't be closed, travel couldn't be stopped, and that things would sort of take care of themselves. And if people died, well, that was just collateral damage, because the most important thing was to keep the economic interests satisfied and to allow the things to take their course. We saw, of course, the, how does one typify it? 500,000 dead in the United Kingdom, 700,000 in the United States, 500,000 dead in Brazil, and the immense pain, disruption caused to the people who were infected, their lives disrupted, destroyed, and all the consequences that followed. In the middle, we had something like the social democratic countries in Europe and elsewhere, where science and common sense prevailed a lot more than it did in the neoliberal economies, and to a greater or lesser degree, things were contained as well as they could be. And that was certainly the case in Australia. There was a big fight in Australia in early 2020 between those who wanted to follow the UK and US approach, which would have been terrible. But thanks to the public health system in Australia, to the premiers, the common sense of the Australian people, and very importantly, to the time we had, the weeks we had to see what was going wrong in Europe, we moved into that lockdown and to basically follow a zero COVID approach. And there were problems in Victoria, of course, but that was the predominant move, and a effective one, which saved a lot of lives and heartache and disruption and jobs for as long as it lasted. And then in China and Taiwan, they went the full zero COVID. They decided to keep it out by whatever means they could. And now 24 months into it, we have in the world really this playing out. Do we live with it, let it run, cope with it as best we can, which is the way the West has sort of gone? Or China, Taiwan, elsewhere, they're not going to do it. They have decided to keep COVID out. And you can have a very big argument about what's sensible and what's the rest of it, but we do have in the world now two distinct ways of coping with COVID as we go into 2022. In my view, in Australia and elsewhere, really, as it turned out, the point about cracking down on COVID, about closing the borders and so on, against all the advice of the travel and tourism industry and the WHO and all the rest of it, was really to play for time until vaccines and treatments could come along and we could do all of the things we needed to do to vaccinate and treat. Remarkably, the vaccines came along. We've never had a vaccine for HIV or a cure, and it took us 13 years or so before we even had reasonably effective treatments. And in the blinking of an eye, last year, science delivered the vaccines. And as critical as I am of the US and the UK on actually dealing with COVID when it first came up, they did invest massively in the vaccines. And by the middle of last year, vaccines were there and were available and were starting to be produced and really made a big difference. So that was a tremendous achievement of science and medicine to do that. And we've seen, nothing but good effects. There's been problems in procurement and supply and so on, as we know in Australia and elsewhere, but of course it's been all to the best. So where are we now? I think as we look forward to next year, we have to understand one of the driving factors of the problem with COVID was that in 2019, 2 billion people were travelling in a year. The international travel and tourism industry was unregulated, out of control in terms of health, surveillance and monitoring. All of that had been abandoned. And millions of people a day were travelling. Wuhan was the 16th biggest airport in China, and 600, 700,000 people a month were departing Wuhan. So when it did emerge, it was out and around, out of Wuhan and into Italy and into America before anybody knew what was happening. It had got out and was being spread around the world. And it spread around the world at the speed of a jet plane. And this created immense havoc. When it became apparent, December, January, what had happened, then there was procrastination and dithering and delay as the international travel and tourism industry totally resisted the idea of shutting down travel, and many countries resisted the idea of shutting down border travel. And WHO said, no, you can't shut down travel, you can't shut down borders, but they were the things that actually worked. But there was this lost period of January, February, and into March when the countries of the world really ought to have moved quickly and effectively, and they didn't. And this created the problem really effectively. China, however, did move swiftly and decisively within China to stop travel. They shut down Wuhan, as we know, but the rest of the world did not take those lessons to heart, and certainly not in a time frame that would have helped. So here we are, we've got 24 months into it, we've got a messy, very unsatisfactory response in the Western countries, and the more neoliberal they were, the worse the response was. China got out in front of it, controlled it. It was proactive, where the Western countries were reactive. Many of the Western countries decided to let it run, whereas China and others said zero COVID. And in Australia, we saw it play out between the states. The states decided to keep it out, to their great credit. The Australian people thought that was a very good idea. and we had very, very low levels of COVID from about October 2020 until the New South Wales government, in its ineffable wisdom, decided to let COVID run in an unvaccinated state from July, with the consequences that we saw in the last few months. But that was not the policy followed, for example, by Queensland and Western Australia. What happened as the vaccines came along, of course, was something that was going to happen as the virus in the world increased, and that was the emergence of a new strain of Delta. So from the middle of 2020, we were in a race, whether we knew it or not, between vaccination and mutation. It meant that we had to move very fast with vaccination to get out ahead of the mutation that Delta became. And as we know, Delta really changed the game. It was more infectious, it was more difficult to stop, and it was very hard to contain. And that had the effects that we have seen. As the vaccination was rolled out, then of course another phenomenon came into play, which was anti-vaccination and the resistance to vaccination. And in this, as so many things, COVID really stripped away a lot of flummery and assumptions about how our world works, and particularly in relation to the uncontrolled, unregulated dissemination of anti-vaccination propaganda and disinformation through Facebook in particular, but not only Facebook. We really created a serious problem for ourselves, which we are still coming to terms with, particularly in Europe and the United States, but also to a degree in Australia. Uncontrolled neoliberalism, I have to say, is at the heart of allowing an entity like Facebook to distribute harmful, really distinctly harmful information about vaccination, about not just vaccination, about many other things, of course, as we know. But in relation to COVID, it has been a terrible, terrible development to allow this to happen. The amount of anti-vaccination information comes from a relative handful of sources, but it's been amplified by the algorithms of Facebook and has really created a great degree of havoc in the United States, to a degree in Europe, and a degree in Australia. So the consequences as we enter the third year of COVID are these: that in Europe, we're heading into a fourth wave. Vaccination coverage has stalled in places like Germany. The restrictions are being reintroduced in Netherlands, in Austria. The assumption that we can have a manageable, low-level prevalence of COVID in the world and in our countries is not right, according to the epidemiologists and the virologists. It's not going to become an endemic disease like influenza. It is going to bounce up and down, and the waves are going to come and go, as we're seeing in Europe as they move into winter there. In the United States, in the last 2 weeks, new cases are up 11%, 11 to 14%. And the political, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but the political disintegration of the United States proceeds apace, and the severe economic stresses we spoke about are coming into play as well politically there. China, Taiwan, Asia, elsewhere, they are still committed to zero COVID, with consequences yet to be seen. But I don't think they're up to be lectured by the West about having to open up to COVID or to restore the status quo ante in relation to international travel and tourism. I don't think we're going to see a speedy return to 2 billion people travelling around the world carefree, and certainly without surveillance and control and restrictions. The international response to vaccination passports, restrictions and so on has been terrible. There is no consistent international regulation of COVID as we move into 2022. So that's not very good. My point is this, really, that wishing and hoping is not a substitute for sustained policy development to cope with COVID and how it's going to mutate and evolve in the next coming months. What are the things we've got to look at? Adam Tooze makes a very good point, and this relates also to climate change, it's got to be said. The stability of economic activity in the world, our social and political cohesion, is dependent really in the end on the stability of the natural environment. COVID is just a fragment of DNA, a virus, climate, molecules of CO2 and methane. They only obey the laws of physics, chemistry and biology. They don't listen to politicians, but we know how to control them. But if we don't get stability back into our natural environment in relation to COVID, in relation to what caused the emergence of the virus, and then it's spread around the world, we're really asking for trouble. If we can't manage to control it, then the social and political consequences become increasingly severe. In relation to health, we desperately need an overhaul of WHO, the international structures around pandemic preparedness and management. These failed us badly when we needed them most, despite a great degree of investment. The WHO panel chaired by Helen Clark and Mail and Johnson Sirleaf came down with excellent recommendations to upgrade the international response, to give WHO autonomy and the speed to move the capacity to move quickly. It is no use debating these things for weeks and months, as happened in 2020. You've got to move fast. You have to move quickly and you have to move effectively. We didn't do it then, and we've got to have the structures in place that allow us to do that now. At national level, we have to reinstate our public health. We have to greatly increase our public health expenditure. It came good in Australia, but in many countries, the public health systems were overwhelmed and they ought to have been far more resilient and better prepared. Trade and tourism, travel and tourism, of course. We can't go back to the free for all. We've got to have a common system of rules and regulations that allow people to travel around the world. We all want to do that. But particularly when it comes to travel between the richer and less developed countries, we've got to have a system in place that allows us to monitor, detect, and if necessary, to take fast and swift action if things go bad. And that comes back to the point of this at the end, the COVAX, to Gavi. We have to vaccinate the world. We are falling way behind in the rich world responsibility to the world entirely. There were 2 billion doses set as the target for COVAX by the end of this year. We're only going to get to about 1.4 billion delivered by the end of 2021. Much greater degree of funding has to go from the rich countries to the COVAX pool, to the Gavi pool. At the moment, 3 doses per 100 are administered in the low-income countries, 120 doses per 100 in the high-income countries. There are more boosters shots, which is good, and 12 to 15-year-old shots being delivered in the rich countries than the entire amount of first vaccine doses being delivered in the poor income countries. In the high income countries, 72% have 1 dose. In the low income countries, 4.4%. And we don't have to go very far in our region to see it's much worse than that, excuse me, in places like Papua New Guinea, 1 or 2% coverage only. In Indonesia, better in the Pacific Islands, but very poor in Africa. Now, it's not just a moral imperative to do that. It's in our interests. If there is a lot of virus in the world, the chances of mutations increase. That's what the scientists tell us. So we've got to get that down. And the way you do that is by vaccination. Australia is pretty good on pledging, but not so good on delivery. We need to do a lot more to up the vaccine funding. Money is the greatest vaccine of all. And compared to the trillions of dollars this has cost us, upping the vaccine distribution and supply is trivial, but the benefits are so great. Why we are shutting down our AstraZeneca manufacturing capacity, it seems, in Melbourne, and not ramping it up, excuse me, to provide vaccines to our region and to the rest of the world through COVAX and Gavi is beyond me. It makes no sense whatsoever. So as we go into 2022, we're still in this race between mutation and vaccination. Vaccination is not enough. We can't vaccinate our way out of it. We've got to have better structures. We've got to have vaccines plus. We've got to be alert and concerned and managing this as we go forward into the next 12 and 24 months. We've got to re-establish, in my view, at the end of this, a lesson we should have learned from HIV, which is prevention. Treatment after the event, of course, is extremely important. Vaccines are extremely important, but we can prevent these problems from occurring. And if they occur when the viruses transmit, we can certainly contain them and make sure that a serious problem does not become a repetition of this epic disaster. And it still has a long way to play out. I wish there were, I am hopeful, right? I mean, science, medicine, the people of the world, a lot of common sense politicians, a lot of people have got the message and are trying to wrestle with it and understand that money is a very important thing to do. We can vaccinate the world. We can reduce the damage that this is going to keep causing us if we play our cards properly and well. We have got to put to one side, I've got to say, extreme neoliberalism. That's failed demonstrably. And following the idea that wishing and hoping and we can rule an end to this because those politicians are over COVID is just silly. That's not going to happen. And if we allow that to happen, then worse things will happen. If we get our act together, learn the lessons, the bitter lessons of the last 24 months, then we can have a much better future going into 2022 and 2023 and beyond, and hopefully put this in the rearview mirror where it belongs. So thanks very much for your time. I'm very happy to have a discussion and answer questions.
Thank you, Bill. It's now over to our questions coordinator, Alex McManus, who will field some questions to you. Over to you, Alex.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ian. Once again, I just remind everyone that you can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's plenty of space available on our question list for tonight, so please feel free to send them through. Bill, for our first question, I want to jump at something that you addressed towards the end of your talk, but maybe go a bit more in detail about it. Our first question is about how Australia can contribute effectively to dealing with COVID-19 in neighbouring countries. What can we do about it?
Money. I mean, money is the greatest vaccine of all. And we've had the emergency phase, right? I mean, it was terribly tough. And nobody could criticise governments really for not getting everything right. Under emergency conditions, it is what it is. Some did a lot better than others, but we got through the emergency phase. But we've come out of it with astonishing vaccines and treatments. Really, it's staggering for anybody who's been involved in public health for as long as I have to see the speed at which science delivered. It's remarkable, truthfully, and the vaccines are very good. The ones that are approved are excellent. They will stop you getting sick. They'll stop you dying. And the treatments have been remarkable too. At the beginning, nobody quite knew what the treatments would be good, but the doctors and the scientists have done very well and they understand it. So that even if you do get sick, you're going to be treated a lot better. You're with hopefully a lot better outcome than you were 12 and 24 months ago. But now we need to back vaccine production and distribution with unlimited money. We spend a lot of money in the rich world on trivial and non-essential things. We have an election coming up in Australia next year and there'll be promises made and money for this and money for that. I mean, there is nothing more important than doing our level best to vaccinate the world, to reduce the amount of virus in the world and therefore reduce the amount of chance of mutation, and to deliver a happier and healthier and more secure and more prosperous world, not just in Australia, but in our region. It's perfectly within our grasp. We have the technology, we have the money. I mean, the money is irrelevant. I mean, you just print money. That's what we've done for 24 months. So we're not constrained by that, but we do seem to be constrained by the political will. And this is lamentable, because it's not only the right moral thing to do, but it's in the interests of the rich country to do. There won't be a return to free and easy international travel until the world is vaccinated, and even then it's going to be a lot different than now. So what Australia needs to do is put its money where its mouth is, and to do it in ways that are unprecedented. But whatever it costs, it'll be a drop in the bucket compared to the costs of not doing it.
Fantastic. Our next question is turning the focus a little bit more long-term. And it asks, if you had to make a long-range prediction, what do you think COVID-19 would look like in 15, 20 years' time, both in Australia and around the world?
I wish if I could do that, I'd be talking to you from my shadow in the south of France, I think. But look, I'm very confident if we apply ourselves on the basis of science and evidence, we can get rid of this thing. I speak to very senior epidemiologists and scientists. We can, over time, eradicate it. It happened with influenza. This is not influenza, but we have it with our capacity to bring this thing under control and to contain it and to manage it, and hopefully over time to manage it out of existence. How this thing mutates, it's in the lap of the gods. I mean, will there be another mutation that is as different from Delta as Delta was from original COVID? I certainly hope not, because if there is, we will have to repeat what we've done in the last 12 months to try to get on top of Delta. So we don't want that to happen. But to do that, we've got to put in place the surveillance and detection and management systems. We cannot just throw up our hands and walk away from this, because COVID will come back. So I think over time, the world can organise itself to live with COVID, at very low levels, and to contain it and to be on top of it so that we control it and it doesn't control us. It will be very interesting, truthfully, to see what China does. Biggest country in the world, the biggest economy. It does not want the Chinese equivalent of 500,000 dead people in the United Kingdom to be replayed in China. That would be tens of millions of people with all the disruption that would cause. So this is a really interesting, it has to be said, bifurcation in the world between what the West is following and what China's following. And we've got to learn, we've got to be humble enough to learn that our way of doing things has not been particularly brilliant, and there might be better ways of organising ourselves to get on top of COVID and the next viral threat. The next viral threat can come along tomorrow. It doesn't have to be COVID. It can emerge from that collision between animals and humans in most of the developing world, and throw something up that we don't want to see. So that's, if we don't get ourselves organised, that's inevitable.
Just following on from what you said there, in your conversations with epidemiologists, what have you found eradication strategies look like at this point? Is there a point of no return from which the disease can't come back? Is that the sort of things that you're hearing?
To listen to them, and of course people like Brendan Crabb and Raina McIntyre, I mean, they're extremely well qualified, and Peter Doherty and so on. They know what they're talking about. They've dealt with viruses. Viruses are present, and we have a pretty good record in the last 4 decades of containing and controlling them. The astonishing thing was it just fell in a heap with COVID. It never had to be like this. And it, for some reason, politics, economics, complacency, arrogance, I don't know, we dropped the bundle when it came to COVID with the consequences that we've seen. But viruses are just viruses. They're not zombie creatures from outer space that are going to destroy the world. They're perfectly able to be managed. And with COVID, as the epidemiologists say, it's not like even Ebola and Zika. It's not as infectious, it's not as damaging. So it was containable. So they are optimistic, but they're optimistic that if you base your policies on science and evidence, you can get on top of it, as I am. Who wouldn't be? But if you allow politics to take hand and lies and disinformation spread through mechanisms like Facebook, we have real problems. And so we need policies based on science and evidence. The applications of those policies will see us through. Policies based on anything else will guarantee a repeat of the last 24 months.
Our next question is, you mentioned the link between the disturbances of nature and the realization of viruses such as COVID-19. What would some of the things we could do? What are some of the things we could do straight away to mitigate against these risks?
Look, the problems are coming from the developing world, where there's been this massive shift from rural to cities. I think Lagos is the biggest city in the world, right, at the moment, but all through the developing world. And there's been this massive shift. And then what's come from the country, the practices of animal husbandry, slaughtering, the mixing of blood and semen and feces and all that sort of in these huge megalopolises. Countries that wised up to this, and China is very interesting in this regard, have been very diligent at trying to really upgrade the standards of sanitation and to keep humans and animals separate. I mean, when I grew up in Tasmania, everybody had chickens in their backyard. The people lived with chickens and all those sorts of things. But that, over time was a threat. If you multiply that in cities of 20 million people and allow that to happen, then you're asking for trouble. So we have got to, I think, really pay and help and allow sanitation, proper markets, animal husbandry, all of this in the developing world. Because as long as we have this out of control urbanisation, but not the sanitation, the sewage, the water, and so on to separate things out, then we're just going to have this perpetual problem with viruses emerging from nature. And 40 years ago, they might have stayed in those cities for a while until we could see what was happening. But now, as in 2019, 2 billion people are travelling around the world every year, so that a problem in a particular city or a virus emerging is out and around the world, and depending just where the people have travelled to, and that creates a global problem, as we've seen. So these are big structural things. And again, we've just got to put the money. We've got to bring the world up to the right standard of sanitation and hygiene and good practice.
Fantastic. I want to pick up on something you discussed earlier in the talk around travel and what that might look like in the future. What do you think travel restrictions and what do you think are the controls that are going to be needed in the future? You talked about earlier in the talk about different levels of surveillance needed moving between countries. Are we going to be able to jump across borders as freely as we used to be able to at any point in the future?
No, I don't. Not quickly. We're not going to go back to being able to get on a plane in Sydney tomorrow and fly to London and then go to Berlin and come home through New York in that way that we did before. It's going to be a lot more considered and a lot more under control. And this is particularly going to be so with the travel industry opening up into the developing world. Those countries do need travel to come back. There's no question. And I'm not for a moment suggesting we should stop travel, but those countries need people to come in. But to do that, they need to operate under a system of vaccination passports, so that and these got to be with integrity, so that we don't have fake or misleading vaccine permissions. If there is a problem in a developing country or with a case, then it's got to be detected and dealt with properly. We've got to have that quarantine, the QR codes, all of these things, but there has to be one national or one international system. At the moment, there's a tremendous hodgepodge of rules and regulations in Europe, America, and around the world, going to Thailand and so on. So all of those are real impediments to travel. Now, if we get that sorted out, travel can resume at higher levels and can be resumed safely. Because the idea really must be that we have people coming and going across borders safely and securely, and to the greatest degree possible, we don't have COVID going with them. That won't be entirely possible, but we can implement the structures and the systems and the monitoring and the reaction to control it. So, but we're still a long way from that. So, and I can tell you that it'll take just one big outbreak somewhere, that goes wrong, where the systems don't work, and we'll be back at square one. It'll be difficult for those receiving countries, the tourism countries, to keep going if there are outbreaks. So, a lot more work needs to be done on regularising and making really good, highly integrated systems that work with integrity, and rebuild trust. Because people won't travel if they don't trust the health systems and the surveillance systems. They won't travel as freely and easily as they would like to do.
Staying on the topic of international regulations and controls, you talked earlier in your talk about the WHO. What are some of the things that need to change at the WHO, and do you think the recommendations that came through in Helen Clark's report are likely to be adopted?
Well, look, the Helen Clark independent panel report was tremendous. It was a really, really tremendous document, and that is the basis for reforming WHO. Now, a lot of people like to have a go at WHO, but the problem with WHO structurally is it is a creature of its member states. It doesn't have an autonomy and a freedom to act unless the member states give it that autonomy and freedom. I think a lot of people look at movies and think there's WHO is out there and moves quickly and rapidly and autonomously to stop these things. And of course, a lot of very good people at WHO do that. But what we saw with COVID was that it dragged out because of the recalcitrance of the member states, and particularly in the United States at that time. They didn't want to do the things that were necessary, and there was procrastination and dithering and delay. Now, the Director General of WHO knew exactly what had to happen, and all the top people in WHO, and I'm sure they were in despair when they were trying to say, move quickly, move rapidly, move fast. But the member states were a drag on that. So that's what's got to be reformed. It's got to have autonomy and flexibility and the ability to move really fast as the virus mutates and as fast as it spreads around the world. And it's all there. I thoroughly recommend that independent panel report. And I would like to see Australia as a long-term senior member of WHO, but others really push hard on this, because unless we get WHO reformed to move quickly, then we will run the risk of repeating the same errors as happened in 2019 and 2020.
Changing gears a little bit now, you've spoken throughout your talk about China's management of the virus and how it seems to be more effective than some of the neoliberal states in the West. Can you go into a little bit more detail about this? Are there any areas of China's policy that have been particularly good? Are there any that have been more problematic? How do they kind of stack up and compare against the things that we've done in the West?
Well, the amazing thing when you look at China is their devotion to acting on the science and evidence. There was certainly, as far as I can see, I'm no expert in this, but obviously there were problems at the state level, the city level and provincial level. And there was a lot of unwillingness to let on as to what was really happening. And that went on for weeks in Wuhan. But when the Beijing authorities and governments finally figured it out that something serious was happening, they moved really fast. And they did the things that were most effective. They shut down Wuhan and the province. and they stopped it moving around China. And I think at the time, people in the West were saying, oh my goodness, can you imagine that, you know, stopping travel, stopping this, stopping that. And we could never do that here. Well, funnily enough, then about 2 or 3 months later, that's exactly what we did do. So the Chinese showed the way then and did it very effectively. Now, the West procrastinated and did it, and a lot of this neoliberal stuff was at the behest of the travel and tourism industry, who said, no, you can't shut down. You can't shut down the borders. You can't do this. You can't do that. You can't do anything else. Well, we didn't do it, or many of the countries in the West didn't do it, and millions of people died, and hundreds of millions of people got sick, and the economies tanked. I mean, really, really. So let's understand what China and Taiwan did. They had the experience of SARS and MERS in the 90s and the 2000s, and that was seared into their, you know, DNA, I think. And they knew that they had to move fast and rapidly, and that gave them time. And to the degree that other countries then moved fast and rapidly, we got time and we controlled it. And then the vaccines and better things came along, and we could, you know, deal with that as we did. So I'm very interested. I think we should all be very interested to see how this plays out in China now, because to judge from what the Chinese authorities are saying, they are not going to open up China. The Winter Olympics, I think, are being held next year. They're not going to have people coming for that. And they are very reluctant to import the caseloads of Delta and the disruption and the drama that we see in the West. Can it work? I mean, will it work? How will it play out? I mean, I have no way of knowing that, but it's happening in front of our eyes, and we should be very humble and alert and try to think what we might learn and apply as we go into 2022.
On the kind of lessons we can learn point, one of the things that you've talked about is the misinformation and disinformation that went through social media through the last 24 months.
Yeah.
Has this been an issue in China and other parts of the world, and how have they managed it?
My hunch is in China, they're not very big on, you know, unrestricted social media. So I'm assuming that a lot of disinformation and so on doesn't make it into the Chinese population. That's not how we play it in the West. We've allowed Facebook to become this Frankenstein's monster, really. And the argument that the Facebook people make is that, well, we're just allowing this to disseminate. Now, we saw politically in the United States the disaster that took over in 2016 when Facebook took that approach. As it played out under the previous administration politically, it's played out in relation to climate change, and it's played out in relation to COVID. And it's been a very big factor in hostility to vaccination. Not vaccine hesitancy, but hostility to vaccination in principle. And this has had really bad results. So I would like to see Facebook and social media, they must be accountable if they allow these things to be published. They're trying, it seems, to stop you know, the most egregious forms of misinformation, but it's too little too late, really. They are publishers of this, and they must be held accountable. And you know, the damage that's been caused by it has been horrible, really horrible. And it's taken an immense effort to correct that in places like Australia. But we see in Germany, where this misinformation has really stalled the vaccine take-up rate, and that's playing out now in the emergence of this fourth wave in Europe. So these are big problems. I mean, COVID has created, exposed great failings and problems, and we've got to apply ourselves now. People of goodwill and science, and you know, that's the great majority of the people of the world really, have got to apply ourselves to fixing up all of these shortcomings and failings that have been exposed by COVID, and the really the reckless dissemination of lies and disinformation that has caused so much trouble. And if we don't get our head around this and correct it, then we're storing up problems for the future.
I think we've got time for one more question, Alex.
Great. Then I'll take this one as the last one. Bill, what do you think we have to be positive about coming out of the second year of this pandemic? Why should we be hopeful about the future when it comes to managing this virus?
I am very hopeful, but I place my faith in the people. We saw in Australia, the Australian people figured this out a long time and a long way ahead of the federal government and many other governments around the world. The public health system is a jewel in Australia, and it was the force from the people who ran public health, the chief health officers, the doctors, the nurses, the allied health professionals, and the common sense of the people who said, no, we don't want this. We're not going to fall for the sucker story in the United States and the United Kingdom about, you know, the freedom of the virus to run around and infect. We will support shutting the borders, stopping movement, keeping it out, and doing the right thing. And they did. So we can have immense faith in the common sense of the people. We can have a lot less faith in the insular, inward-looking politicians around the world who've listened to a lot of other things, economics, interests, beyond science and the rest of it, and tried to tell you the choice was between shutting down and opening up, you know, that we had to keep the economy functioning. Well, the people showed them that they were wrong. The economy functioned in Australia fine under the COVID period. We've come through it in reasonably good shape, not as good as we should have, but we're getting there. And if we keep our wits about us and the Australian people keep showing the way and telling the Australian politicians in very short order, we do not want this thing to get out of control again. We don't want the lockdowns, but we want it to be managed. We want you to look after our health, our security, and our prosperity. That's your job. And if the Australian people keep them to that, then we'll come out ahead well.
Well, let's end on that optimistic note. That's always good. Bill, thank you very much. Let me just mention a couple of forthcoming activities. Later this week, we'll be putting out the next edition of our recommended readings columns from Glover Cottages. Next week, on Tuesday, the 23rd of November, our 5 interns will each give a short address on an international topic of their choice. And then as our program year comes towards its end on 30th of November, we're going to have an event that will look back on the Whitlam visit to China in 1971, 50 years ago, and assess what's been going on since then. But now it's a pleasure to invite Grace Bowie, one of our interns, to move a vote of thanks to Professor Botel.
Good evening. It's an honor to be asked to offer a vote of thanks for tonight's event. On behalf of the Institute, I'm very grateful to everyone for sharing their graceful words and wisdom with us. We are very fortunate to have a very distinguished identity from the public health sector. This evening, Bill Botel was made an officer in the Order of Australia in 2012 in recognition of his significant role in developing public health policy and programs. His account of the work of public health management of different countries and international organizations, especially the Australian and international response to COVID-19, has given us a window into seeing the pandemic as both a challenge, an opportunity, and a commitment of Australia to the regional as well as the global community, an aspect of international relations that now needs to be addressed since Australia has overcome the pandemic and is looking beyond the post-pandemic world. And Bill has conveyed a great deal about his knowledge and experience of public policy formation in responding to COVID-19 and Australia's support for all the countries. This talk has generated some great questions from the audience, and Bill has given great answers. He made the particularly telling point that Australia, as a middle power located in the Asia-Pacific region, should be doing more to safeguard its regional neighbours from COVID-19 outbreaks to secure its own pandemic success and the region's prosperity. Thank you, Bill, for your work and for your address tonight.
Thank you very much. A pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our participants and good night.